The wind swept across the ridges with the cry of a wounded thing. A voice that carried sorrow down through the black pines and over the desolate gulch where an old cabin clung to the slope. Inside, Abigail Hartwell lay beneath a patchwork quilt worn thin with age, her breath shallow, her belly round beneath the faded cotton of her dress. The storm rattled the shutters and pressed its cold fingers through the chinks in the walls. She closed her eyes, but the sound was relentless, reminding her of how small she was, how forgotten. Each inhalation hurt, as though winter itself pressed upon her chest. She had once believed she would walk into a church with her head lifted high, arm in arm, with a man who promised her love. But he had vanished like smoke when her condition began to show. His letters stopped, his name became a curse upon the lips of neighbors, and Abigail was left to carry both the child and the shame. The town had not forgiven. Women turned their faces. Men watched with hard judgment. The sheriff himself, Sheriff Amos Ruhr, told her flatly, a woman makes her choices, and she must live with them. That sentence had been her exile. She had packed what she could, climbed the ridges until her body shook, and settled in this forgotten shelter on the edge of the mountain. Now the snow whispered against the roof, a steady shroud. Hunger gnawed at her ribs. She had not eaten since dawn, a crust of bread that crumbled in her hands. She thought of the stores dwindling in the corner cupboard, a sack of cornmeal nearly gone, a jar of dried beans. Even if the child inside her could hear, what comfort could she offer? That it was coming into a world that had already turned its back. She pressed her palm against her belly, whispering without sound. The baby shifted slightly, as though reminding her that even in despair, life stirred. The fire in the hearth dimmed. She dragged herself up, every movement heavy with weariness. Gathering her shawl around her shoulders, she crossed to the hearth and laid the last of the split logs on the coals. Sparks leapt, then died into embers. Tomorrow she would need to fetch more, though her strength faltered each time she bent. The cabin door creaked against the wind. She thought at first it was nothing more than the storm's hand, rattling loose wood, but then came a sound deeper, more deliberate, a crunch of boots on frozen earth. Abigail froze. Wolves sometimes prowled these slopes, but wolves did not tread so slowly, so heavily. She reached for the iron poker beside the hearth, her fingers trembling. The door pushed inward, snow swirled in, followed by a figure towering in the gloom, shoulders broad beneath a buffalo hide coat, beard thick with frost. His eyes, gray as riverstone, swept the room and settled on her. He did not move closer, neither spoke. The storm howled behind him, impatient for him to enter or leave. Abigail's heart pounded. "What do you want?" Her voice was thin, ragged. The man did not answer. He reached into the satchel, slung across his chest, and pulled out a wrapped bundle. He set it on the small table by the door, jerked venison, hard bread, small tin of coffee. Without a word, he stepped back in the storm and was gone, the door banging shut behind him. For long minutes, she did not move. The poker slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. Only when the fire hissed and spat did she stir. She stumbled to the table, her breath breaking in sobs she had not intended. Food enough to last days. She pressed her hands to her face, half in disbelief, half in shame. What debt had she now incurred? In the morning, weak sunlight pushed through the frost-rimmed window. Abigail forced herself to fetch water from the creek, though her legs trembled on the icy path. As she bent at the bank, she felt eyes upon her. She turned sharply. Across the clearing, standing half hidden among the trees, was the man again. Jonah McGraw, the town once called him. She remembered faintly a soldier returned from war, then gone to the hills, living apart like some animal untamed. Whispers said he had blood on his hands, that he preferred solitude to salvation. His gaze was steady, unreadable. She clutched her bucket and hurried back inside, pulse hammering. That night, another bundle appeared at her door. She had not heard him come or go. Inside were split logs, dry kindling, a piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth. She set them down gently, her heart twisting between gratitude and defiance. She did not want charity. She did not want to witness to her frailty. But when she ate, when the warmth of the wood filled the room, she wept softly, her tears falling into the shadows. The days turned one into another. Jonah did not speak, but his presence lingered in the quiet offerings left behind. A jar of honey, a coil of rope, a fur pelt to soften her bed. Abigail's pride resisted. She told herself she would return all once strength returned, once the child came safely. Yet each night, as the wind pressed cold against the cabin walls, she found herself clutching the quilt tighter, imagining that someone somewhere still thought her worthy of survival. One afternoon, weak sunlight broke the clouds. She ventured outside to gather snow for melting. Her hands shook and the world tilted. She leaned against the cabin's wall, dizzy. When she looked up, Jonah was there carrying an armload of wood. He stopped short, his eyes flicking over her frail form. She wanted to speak, to tell him to leave, but her throat closed. Instead, he set the wood neatly beside the door, then crouched to split it with practiced ease, his axe rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed older than words. Abigail stood silent, watching the breath cloud from his beard, the muscles of his arms straining against worn leather. He did not look at her again. When the task was finished, he simply nodded once and walked into the trees. That night, Abigail sat near the fire with her hands resting on her belly. She thought of the gossiping women in town, of Lydia Pike whispering about her disgrace. They would never know of this, of the quiet mercy of a man living beyond their circle. They would never see the way his silence carried more comfort than all their sharp tongues combined. The storm deepened as winter pressed harder. One evening, the snow came so thick that Abigail could not see beyond the window. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and tried to fetch water from the bucket outside, but the cold pierced her lungs. She staggered, slipping on the ice, the bucket clattering. Pain lanced through her belly. She cried out and fell to her knees. The cold bit into her skin, darkness swimming at the edges of her sight. The last thing she heard was the crunch of boots. Fast, urgent, strong arms lifted her, the smell of leather and pine close against her face. She was carried through the storm, the door flung open, the firelight blinding. She felt herself laid gently on the quilt, a heavy blanket drawn over her. Jonah's figure loomed in the firelight, rough hands placing wood on the flames, coaxing the blaze higher. His movements were clumsy yet careful, as though afraid she might break. She tried to speak, but could only shiver, teeth chattering. He pressed a tin cup of broth to her lips. She swallowed weakly, warmth spreading down into the hollow ache of her body. For the first time in many months, she let herself lean, just slightly against the presence of another. His silence was not judgment, but shelter, not scorn, but a kind of reverence. She met his gaze, steady, unflinching, gray as the mountain stone, and for the briefest moment she felt less alone. Yet beneath that warmth lingered a tremor and unspoken truth: storms did not break so easily. The child was coming, the world outside was merciless, and the man who now watched over her carried secrets carved as deep as her own. The fire roared, the storm raged, and the cabin seemed both cradle and coffin. Abigail closed her eyes, clutching her belly as a sharp pang coursed through her. When she opened them again, Jonah's shadow leaned close, his voice low for the first time, rough as gravel, yet softened by something she could not name. "Hold on," he murmured. It was only 2 words, but they carried more promise than all the vows she had once believed. And as the storm pounded against the walls, Abigail realized that her fight for survival had only just begun. The days after Jonah carried her in from the storm blurred together, marked by the rhythm of firelight and silence. Abigail woke to the smell of broth, to the sight of wood stacked neatly by the hearth, to the awareness that someone had chosen to stay near. She did not ask why, and he did not offer. Yet something in the stillness between them began to shift, as though 2 broken timbers had leaned together and found enough strength to stand. Jonah moved about the cabin with quiet certainty, fixing leaks in the roof, patching the sagging door, splitting wood until his shoulders glistened with sweat. Abigail, watching him from her place on the quilt, began to see more than the hardened lines of his face. There was a care in his hands when he touched the tools, respect in the way he built the fire, a reverence that seemed almost prayerful. He rarely spoke, but when he did, the words came rough and slow like stones rolled from deep water. In those days Abigail's body warred with itself. The child pressed heavier upon her spine. Her breath came shorter, her strength drained quicker than she wished to admit. Yet Jonah was always there, sliding the bucket of water closer before she could rise, handing her bread without looking at her directly, tending to the chores she could not. He never reached too far, never presumed too much. Yet his presence filled the room more surely than the fire. Once, as dusk painted the snowfields with lavender light, Abigail found him whittling a small piece of pine. His great hands dwarfed the knife, but the shavings curled soft as silk to the floor. She asked what he was making. Jonah hesitated, then held out a small figure, a horse, rough but recognizable, its form etched with patience. For the child, he muttered, almost embarrassed. Something in her chest broke at the gesture, a warmth spreading where shame had once lived. She took it carefully, her fingers brushing his. He withdrew quickly as though burned, but the spark lingered. The town still haunted her. Supplies ran thin, and she could not avoid venturing back for flour and cloth. She dreaded the eyes that would follow, the whispers that would stick like burrs to her skin. Yet Jonah harnessed a mule and walked beside her. His long stride steady, his silence like a shield. When they entered the store, the hush was instant. Lydia Pike's sharp voice rose from near the shelves. "Back again. Are you carrying your sins in plain sight?" The other women snickered, hiding behind bonnets and glances. Abigail lowered her eyes, heart hammering, but Jonah stepped closer, his frame casting a shadow across the room. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His presence alone silenced the whispers, his gaze heavy as stone on anyone who dared to meet it. Abigail gathered her things, her hands shaking, but for the first time she did not feel entirely flayed by their judgment. She left with Jonah at her side, the snow crunching beneath them, and though no words were spoken, gratitude thrummed in her veins. Back at the cabin, she sat by the fire and touched the wooden horse. Jonah remained near the door as if ready to retreat again into solitude. But Abigail broke the silence. "They will never forgive me," she said softly. "The town, the people, they've decided who I am." Her voice cracked. "And maybe they're right." Jonah's head lifted. His eyes caught the firelight, gray flecked with something softer. "People talk because they fear their own emptiness," he said. The words were slow, deliberate. "You don't owe them your life." Abigail looked at him, startled by the depth in his voice. She wanted to ask more about his scars, his silence, why he lived alone on the ridge, but the weight in his eyes stopped her. Some wounds were carved too deep for easy telling. Still, in that moment, she felt less like a castaway and more like someone standing on the edge of something fragile but real. Winter tightened its grip. The nights grew long, the storms heavier. Abigail's belly ached with the child's restless turning, and fear whispered in every shadow. What if she did not survive? She tried to prepare, gathering cloths, heating water, but her hands trembled. Jonah, sensing her unrest, began spending nights in the chair by the fire, as though his sheer presence could hold the world at bay. The storm that would change everything came in late February. Snow hammered the roof like fists, wind shrieking through the gaps. Abigail woke in the dark to a wrenching pain that stole her breath. The child was coming. Her cry broke through the cabin, sharp and raw. Jonah was instantly at her side, his rough hands hovering uncertainly. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice taut with fear. Through gritted teeth, Abigail tried to remember the old midwife's lessons, half-heard whispers about breathing, about bearing down. Sweat poured from her as wave after wave of pain racked her body. Jonah moved quickly, boiling water, tearing cloth into strips, his hands trembling though his face remained set. Hours bled together in firelight and screams. The storm outside matched the storm within. Snow crashing against the windows, wind clawing at the cabin walls. Jonah's deep voice rumbled low, coaxing her, steadying her. "Hold on," he repeated over and over as though the words themselves were a rope he was throwing to her drowning form. At last, with one final tearing cry, the child slipped into the world. Jonah caught the tiny body in his great hands, his breath shuddering as the newborn let out a fragile wail. For a moment, silence fell, broken only by that thin cry. Jonah's eyes shone as he wrapped the child in cloth and placed it gently in Abigail's arms. She looked down, tears streaming, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Alive," she whispered. "We are alive." She pressed her lips to the child's damp head, the smell of new life mingling with sweat and smoke. Jonah sank back on his heels, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what had just passed. Outside, the storm raged still. But inside the cabin, a different storm had broken. One of love, of terror, of fierce survival. Jonah sat in silence, his gaze fixed on mother and child, something unspoken breaking across his features. For years, he had hidden himself from the world, burying grief beneath solitude. Yet here, in this fragile cabin, life had forced its way back, in demanding his hands, his heart. Days later, when the storm had passed, the world seemed washed clean. Snow draped the hills in unbroken white, and sunlight glinted like diamonds on the drifts. Abigail, pale but strong, sat near the window with the child in her arms. Jonah stood at the door, looking out toward the town below. The gossip would not end. The judgments would not vanish, but within the cabin, something greater had been forged. When spring thaw came, wild flowers pushed up through the earth, stubborn and bright. Abigail walked slowly into the meadow. The baby swaddled against her chest. Jonah followed, his shadow long beside hers. They did not speak of love nor promise it in words. Instead, their gestures spoke, his hand steadying her elbow, her gaze lingering on his profile, the silent trust that had taken root. The townsfolk, curious, began to see them together. Some whispered still, others watched in silence. Yet gossip held less weight when faced with the sight of Abigail walking with her head higher. Jonah carrying the child with a tenderness that belied his rugged frame. Dignity had replaced shame. Quiet strength had answered scorn. One evening, as the sun set behind the peaks in a blaze of gold, Abigail stood on the cabin's porch, the baby cooing softly. Jonah joined her, his face shadowed by the fading light. For a long moment, they watched the horizon where the sky bled into fire. "Do you ever think," Abigail asked softly, "that we were meant to be left alone, just so we'd find each other here?" Jonah's silence stretched, then broke with a voice low but sure. "Sometimes the ashes hold more life than the flame." Abigail turned, meeting his gaze. In the gray depths of his eyes, she saw not just survival, but promise. The mountain wind brushed past, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. For the first time, she believed that the world, harsh as it was, might still hold a place for her, for them. The child stirred, crying softly, and Jonah reached out, his callous hand cradling the small bundle with surprising gentleness. Abigail watched him, her heart swelling with something stronger than gratitude, deeper than relief. It was love, not declared, not demanded, but breathed into the very air between them. The sun dipped lower, the last blaze of light, washing the cabin in gold. Inside, the fire waited, the wooden horse rested on the mantel, and three lives intertwined by storm and silence, prepared to step into whatever tomorrow would bring. And as darkness gathered, Abigail felt it. The storm that had once threatened to end her had instead given her back a life remade. A love born not of thunder, but of quiet endurance.